to Mao's China, 1949 to 1967. This lecture is going to go through an overview of the course. It will take you through how they were able to establish control. It will look at the plans that changed agriculture and industry, and it will look at the Cultural Revolution. So we'll get started. So in 1949, the Civil War came to an end. Now, the Civil War had started in 1946 and it went on for 3 years. This Civil War, as we can see here, was between the nationalists and the communists. The nationalists, they had the GMD army and they were led by this man called Chiang Kai-shek. The nationalists had been in charge of China for some time, but as the communists started to rise, and the communists were led by Mao Zedong, as the communists started to rise, we had the start of a civil war. Now, the civil war went on for 3 years, and it created a large amount of devastation in China. Okay, there was huge loss of manpower, huge loss of industry and agriculture. So when the civil war finally came to an end in 1949, the communists declared victory, and China was now declared as the People's Republic of China. Okay, so Mao had won. He, alongside the People's Liberation Army, who were his army, had won the civil war and they had come out on top. Having won the civil war, they then needed to quite quickly establish themselves as a strong power within China. And one of the ways in which Mao did that is in 1950, so a year after winning the Civil War, he launched a campaign of terror against counter-revolutionaries. Now, Mao's aim as leader of the PRC, People's Republic of China, was to instill continuous revolution. So anybody who was deemed a counter-revolutionary, somebody who would slow down the revolution, needed to be removed from the population. Which is why this campaign of terror was launched in 1950. Alongside this, in order to gain the support of the majority of the population, who were at the time the peasants, they made up 80% of the population, Mao launched the Agrarian Reform Law. This law redistributed land. It took it away from the landlords and distributed it to the peasants. So the peasants now had control over sections of land. That created greater amount of supports for the communists and meant that people were now on side. Alongside this, in order to promote unity within China and to show China as a superpower in the eyes of its international allies, China got involved in the Korean War in 1950. So as part of the Korean War, China launched a slogan, "Resist America, Aid Korea." The aim of that slogan was to show people that they were uniting against a capitalist front, and that getting involved in the Korean War would be a way of, reducing that capitalist rule over the world and aiding Korea against them. So this slogan was published. Lots and lots of propaganda posters, as the one you can see on the screen, were published alongside this. The aim was to get people of China united against this one common enemy, who in this case was the United States. There were obviously consequences to the Korean War. It led to a huge loss of manpower as troops were sent in to fight, and it also had a massive hit on the economy. The economy took a big hit because a lot of those men who would have worked to improve the industry and the agriculture were sent to war instead. So we had positive impacts of the Korean War in that China was now seen as an international superpower, but we also had negative impacts for China itself in that its economy suffered as a result of this. Then we move on to kind of a couple years into power, 1953, we have the launch of this thing called the First Five-Year Plan. Now, the aim of the First Five-Year Plan was to nationalise industry and collectivise agriculture. So everything would essentially become state-owned. What that meant was all the landlords, lost their land, and it was now the property of the state. It also effectively reversed the agrarian reform law. We also moved towards this idea of collectivization. So all the land is collected, it's state owned, and everybody works on that land. So there are no real profiteers from this. What it means is everybody gets the same wages, everybody is getting the same amount of produce. So the first 5-year plan is launched in 53 and goes on as far as 57. Then we have the 100 Flowers movement. Now this was another means of establishing communist control. The idea of the 100 Flowers movement was Mao calling for a debate where he stated, "Let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend." So the aim of this campaign was to get the intellectuals to come forward and criticise Mao and criticise the runnings of the government. Now, one of the reasons that Mao launched this campaign was due to the process of de-Stalinisation, which was happening in Hungary. Now, Stalin was an incredibly harsh leader, and Mao was worried that if he was presented as an incredibly harsh leader, the same situation would enforce in China. So in order to avoid this, he launched the 100 Flowers campaign. Okay, that was launched in 1956, not 1953 as it says there. It was launched in 1956, but initially people were very, very reluctant to join the campaign. He didn't get that flood of criticism that he had kind of hoped for. People were reluctant, they were scared, and part of the reason they were scared is because in 1950 they'd seen this campaign of terror against counter-revolutionaries. So what was done is in 1957, in February, Mao took to the stage and he requested people to come forward with criticism. He said he was open to it. He went as far as launching in the People's Daily newspaper the ability for people to come forward. Okay, it was advertised, they were encouraged to come forward. So slowly a trickle of criticism started to come in, but eventually it started to flood in, which caused concern for Mao. So in 1957, in June, he launched an anti-rightist campaign, which brought a halt to the system and stopped all debate around matters. Following this, in 1958, Mao launched a second 5-year plan. Now, he saw some successes from the first 5-year plan and felt that a second one would help speed up the development of the industry and the agriculture. This second 5-year plan is also sometimes known as the Great Leap Forward. But eventually, this Great Leap Forward had a lot of detrimental consequences on China. The aims of it were to increase steel and grain production. They were given equal priority, and this was known as walking on 2 legs. They were given equal priority. Communal living was embedded into China. All private farming was abolished, and they adopted this policy of Lysenkoism. Mao encouraged people to donate any iron and steel that they had. They planted backyard furnaces. Within those backyard furnaces, the iron and steel were melted together to produce low-grade quality iron and steel. Okay, so the aim of this campaign was to meet the production requirements regardless of the quality. But what it meant was a large part of people's focus was put in the industry, and the agriculture suffered as a result of this. So that led to the Great Famine of 1958 to 1962. So you can see here there's a picture of all the crops looking pretty devastated. So the results were catastrophic. Mao had to take part of the blame for this because the impacts were so severe. As a result of that, in 1960, he eventually stepped down as head of state. Okay, he stepped down as head of state, and then 1 year later, China split with the Soviet Union. That split becomes definite. So in 1961, the Sino-Soviet Treaty comes to an end. And the reason for that is seeing the failures of the Great Leap Forward, the USSR pull all of their scientists and the help that they had provided China with, they pull those people out and take them back to the USSR in order to separate themselves from that failure. So the Sino-Soviet Treaty comes to an end in 1961. 3 years later, China see themselves carrying out successful nuclear tests. And part of the reason for this was to also establish themselves as a superpower, because at the time, the arms race was also taking place between the USSR and the United States. So, moving forward, we then enter the period of the Cultural Revolution. So Mao had stepped down as head of state. He'd kind of lost a little bit of his power. In order to regain that power and see revolution continue within China, Mao launches the Cultural Revolution in 1966. Now, the aim of the Cultural Revolution was to remove this thing called the Four Olds in China. Now, the aims were to remove old customs, old habits, old ideas, and old traditions. Okay, that was the aim of the Cultural Revolution. And when Mao stood up in 1966 in Tiananmen Square, alongside Lin Biao, who was the head of the PLA at the time, he called people forward. He targeted students specifically to come and join this movement. And we saw the creation of this group of individuals called the Red Guards. Now, the Red Guards, their aim was to remove the Four Olds. Okay? And what it meant was he was able to mass mobilise the population, target the people who hadn't seen the devastation of the Great Famine, and get them on board with his ideas. And what they did, the Red Guards essentially destroyed a large amount of education, because they stormed universities, they stormed libraries, they destroyed books. A large proportion of things in China were destroyed, okay, because the attack on the Four Olds was a pretty vague explanation given to them. So, what then happened is Mao started to see that the Red Guards were getting a little bit out of control. So he called upon Lin Biao and the PLA and requested to them, not entirely requested, ordered them to disband the Red Guards and send the Red Guards up to the countryside. Here the Red Guards were now expected to continue the revolution, but by supporting the agricultural work in the countryside. This happened in 1968, and then in 1971 we see the fall of Lin Biao. Now, Lin Biao, as we know, was head of the PLA. He had been a very important member of the army and was essentially the leader of pursuing the cult of Mao. Okay, but there were concerns that Lin Biao was becoming too popular, and that popularity concerned Mao. So in 1971 there were conspiracies surrounding Lin Biao and suggestions that he was a communist, a Soviet Union communist ally. He was labelled a Soviet spy, and in 1971 he was killed in a plane crash. Following this, President Nixon of the United States in 1972 visits China for the first time since it had become a communist state, and we start to see better relations with the West. So Chinese relationships with the West seem to be getting better. We then have a succession struggle as Mao starts to become older, starts to lose some of his power. There are other members of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, who start to try and take that power. And one of those people is Deng Xiaoping. Now, throughout communist rule, Deng Xiaoping is seen as a pragmatist. Okay, he is communist, but he wants to instill pragmatism within China in order to better the economy and improve the standard of living. As part of this succession struggle, he comes out on top. Okay, Deng Xiaoping is rehabilitated in 1973. And when Mao dies in 1976, it is Deng Xiaoping who takes his position as head of state. So that is an overview of the course so far. So we see the communists winning the civil war in 1949. The state of the country is incredibly poor. In order to establish control, Mao tackles the industry, he tackles agriculture, he tackles the international prestige through the Korean War, and he instills terror against counter-revolutionaries. Okay? By tackling the industry and the agriculture, he removes private ownership and everything becomes state-owned. On top of that, he tries to avoid the equivalent of desalinization happening in China, but soon removes that as a part of China because the criticism was coming in too quickly. He then launches the second 5-year plan, which tries to meet really high production goals but leads to the Great Famine. The relationship with the Soviet Union comes to an end. They produce successful nuclear tests. He launches the Cultural Revolution, eventually brings that to an end too. Relationships with the West become better, and eventually Mao dies. So that is an overview of the course so far. And we will look at, in further lectures, the separate key topics in and of themselves.